taking a look at the Modern Banlist Part 2. If you haven't checked out Part 1, please do that before seeing this list. So we're going in alphabetical order. Now there are 45 cards on the Modern Banlist. First video covered cards 1 through 12. We're starting with alphabetical order number 13, Faithless Looting. Now Faithless Looting was a card banned in part because of Hogak. Now this is a card that almost never does anything fair. It's a card that's draw 2, discard 2, and has flashback of 2 and a red. Very similar to a card in Legacy called Careful Study, with the ability of flashing it back from the graveyard. It's part of the reason why this card was so powerful. Now this generally enables graveyard-centric strategies, decks like Dredge, the aforementioned Hogak, and one of the decks that kind of died with this card, which was Arclight Phoenix, which was a little bit more of a fair deck, but still was inherently trying to do unfair things with a card. Now, this card exists in some other form, but they've printed weaker versions of it, never quite to the power of Faithless Looting. You have things like Cathartic Reunion, you have cards like Haggle, and there are some other options out there, but I think it's best to just leave this one on the ban list, as it just generally enables very broken graveyard strategies, and the format's been a little bit better with the absence of overly reliable graveyard enablers. Field of the Dead. Now this is one of two very unique cards in the modern format. The other one being Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. That is, whenever you have certain conditions met with Valakut, it happens to be 6 mountains. With Field of the Dead, if you have 7 or more lands with different names, you start generating 2/2 zombies every time a land enters the battlefield. Now this obviously gets dangerous in multiples, and obviously is more powerful in a long drawn-out game. Now this was banned right around the same time as things like Arkham's Astrolabe and Uro, simply because of the power it did to nullify a lot of traditional mid-range based decks. Now you could argue that those decks are no longer really a part of the format anyway, and Field of the Dead would give an interesting angle of attack for decks attacking decks like 4-color Omnath. And the only deck that this would immediately slot into would be a deck like Amulet Titan. However, this card would be a little bit dangerous to unban simply because of the impact it had on the format before it. Now this is still legal in Legacy and is banned in Pioneer for very similar reasons for its being banned in Modern, but this is a card that could conceivably come off the ban list and try out to see if it's safe for the format or not, but may still be best left on the ban list. Gitaxian Probe. If you go back to my little rant on Birthing Pod, if it's Phyrexian mana, it's generally dangerous. This card allows you to look at your opponent's hand and draw a card. The danger with this card is not only does it give you information to perfectly play on the next turn or two, it also replaces itself at the cost of 2 life. You don't even have to necessarily spend mana to play it. This was mostly leveraged in decks like Death Shadow and Infect, decks that were not trying to do inherently fair things. Now, this card is also banned in Legacy and in addition to Modern, and it just basically reduces the size of your deck for no cost restriction at all. The nearest thing left to it in the Modern format is Mishra's Bauble, and even that card has been contentious at points and gotten cards like Luris of the Dream Den banned, but for that reason, Gitaxian Probe should remain banned, because it just doesn't add anything positive to the format. Glimpse of Nature. Now, Glimpse of Nature is a powerhouse in the Legacy format, particularly in the card Elves. This card says, whenever you play a creature spell this turn, draw a card. Now, there have been replacements for this card printed, most notably Beck Call, which requires, I believe, 1 green and 1 blue mana, and that card has done absolutely nothing in the Modern format. And if there are decks that could use a boost in power, it would be tribal decks like Elves. That said, there is some exploitative possibilities with this card. It really does not do anything fair, especially in a deck that can generate a bunch of mana like Elves. You could conceivably bring it back into the Modern format to give a deck like Elves a shot in the arm and maybe turn the format a little bit fairer or a little bit more broken in terms of the power of tribal strategies. So this is certainly a card that you could consider unbanning, but would certainly be a little bit dangerous to do so. And as examined by the next card on our list, sometimes if it was broke once, don't try to fix it again. That aforementioned card is Golgari Grave Troll. Now this is the most powerful dredger available. Now dredge is a replacement mechanic that allows you to get rid of one of your draws to replace it by putting that many cards in the graveyard, and then you effectively draw this card. Now the power this allows is mostly in a deck known as, by the namesake mechanic, Dredge, which allows you to arbitrarily put 4, 5, 6, depending on the number of cards flipping it over into your graveyard, allowing you to put things like Narcomoebas into play, and just exploiting graveyard synergies in that way. Grave Troll was the most dangerous simply because it dredges the most. Now Stinkweed Imp dredges 5. There is a world of difference between 5 and 6, and the fact that you could play Grave Troll with 6, Stinkweed on 5, and then you'd only have to include a couple of copies of Golgari Thug on 4, whereas now you're required to play the 5 and the 4 in order to have the best possible dredges you can have. This card was banned, I believe, toward the beginning of the Modern format. They risked unbanning it and then had to ban it again because dredge was too powerful. Now that was in part still the presence of Faithless Looting. However, I think it's just best to leave well enough alone and not risk unbanning this card for a second time. Great Furnace, copy and paste my entry about Ancient Den. Basically, this is an artifact land that comes into play untapped. There's a little bit of danger with it with things like Arcbound Ravager, Disciple of the Vault, Cranial Plating, those kind of things. You could potentially bring these back into the format, but really adds no notable power to the format except to Affinity specifically. And that might just be a little too dangerous to allow unchecked. So if you're going to leave one off the list, all 5 of them should stay banned. Green Sun Zenith. Now this is a card where there have been a myriad of replacements for it. Most notably Finale of Promise, and the other option being Court of Calling, being 2 different cards that do effectively the same thing as Green Sun Zenith. Now Zenith being just that 1 mana cheaper is dangerous in decks that are able to generate a ton of mana and could use something like Primeval Titan or Dryad Arbor. Now those arguments ring a little bit more hollow in today's Modern format, as there are a lot more ways to answer creatures, etc. And toolbox decks could definitely use another shot in the arm with something like Green Sun Zenith. I kind of put it in the same camp as Birthing Pod. It is a card you could conceivably unban and would improve certain aspects of the format, and might slot into something like Amulet Titan or something like Red Green Valakut, or generate new archetypes such as some type of mid-range Hate Bear style deck. But this card has been on the ban list for quite some time. It's one of the few cards, along with something like Birthing Pod, that I could see unbanned immediately and have moderate effect on the format, like things like Stoneforge Mystic and Jace the Mind Sculptor before it, but for now remains on the ban list. Alright, next up is Hogak Arisen Necropolis. You cannot spend mana to cast this spell. Okay, how are you supposed to cast this 7 mana, 5 hybrid green black, Convoke, Delve. So you can convoke it with creatures in play, or you can delve. Now, as we've seen with Dig Through Time, Delve is a very dangerous mechanic, especially in a card that doesn't allow you to pay mana for it. You may cast Hogak Arisen Necropolis from your graveyard. So you can mill this thing and play it from your graveyard without ever paying mana for it. Not a very good combination of things if you know anything about the history of Magic. So you also get this 8/8 Trampler that even if your opponent happens to kill it, you can then bring it back again. Hogak very much was one of the more broken cards out of Modern Horizons 1. People complain out of the powerful cards out of Modern Horizons 2, but they forget that there were some really stupid cards in Modern Horizons 1. Hogak being the chief among them, and it got no less than 3 cards, including itself banned, Bridge from Below, Faithless Looting, and this. Just no, don't bring it back. Hypergenesis. Now, Hypergenesis is a suspend 1 green card. You cannot cast this card naturally. So how do you get around that? You can do it in one of 2 different ways. You can do it with things like Electro Balance or As Foretold to cast it from your hand, as those allow you to get around the restrictions for it. Or you can use the Cascade mechanic, with things like Shardless Agent, Violent Outburst, Ardent Plea. Hypergenesis basically allows you to play Show and Tell with your opponent. Now, Show and Tell is a card in Legacy that says put put an artifact, creature, or enchantment, or land from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is a good way to cheat in things like Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, Traxa, etc. What this deck aimed to do was put absurdly powerful permanents onto the battlefield and kind of win from there. Nowadays, you also add things like Omniscience, and I forget what the 9-mana version of Omniscience is, but there are many different broken things you can put into play, much like Glimpse combo tries to do, except from your hand rather than random flips off the top of your deck. Now, this card could conceivably brought into the format and do powerful things, but still be fun. But when you already have Cascade decks like Living End, Rhinos, and Glimpse combo, which tries to do what this deck does, only off of random flips off the top of your deck rather than cards from your hand, really doesn't feel like it's worth bringing back into the format. It is legal in Legacy, but Legacy also has a little bit more defense against it. So for that reason, Hypergenesis should probably remain banned, even if it could be a fun Wild Wild West thing to bring into the format. Alright, next up is Karak or Karak Clan Ironworks. Not entirely sure how to pronounce that. This card was banned because it was an engine piece of a deck that was excessively obnoxious. Now, throughout Magic's history, there have been a couple of style of decks known as eggs. Now, eggs refers to cards like Chromatic Star, Chromatic Sphere, that you tap, sacrifice it to get some mana, draw a card, etc. There were an actual cycle of things that had the name something and then eggs, hence the name of the word eggs. Now, the first version of this was banned into oblivion with the banning of the card Second Sunrise that we'll talk about in a later video. But Karak Clan Ironworks was kind of the spiritual successor to that. It really utilized this along with some different cards that would allow you to bring things out of your graveyard and recast them to kind of create this loop where you would create a very large amount of mana and draw a large number of cards. The problem is, number one, this was very time-consuming in the turns, especially people that were newer or as unfamiliar with a lot of the tricks of the deck, and it was not deterministic. Unlike a lot of 1 or 2 card combos, a deck like Living End, this deck did a lot of wheel spinning sometimes and just didn't get anywhere. So you literally have your opponents sitting there sometimes 7, 10, 12-minute turns, and they were never quite sure if they were dead. Now, it was a very low chance to fail, but still, you couldn't guarantee that your opponent was going to kill you. Not only that, this deck could go off on as early as turn 3, because Mox Opal was also in the format at the time. And not allowing you to get to this point where you cast your namesake card on turn 3, and then just went absolutely nuts, kind of playing a game of solitaire for the next 7 to 10 minutes. Wizards kind of frowns upon the game of solitaire, unless you're Amulet Titan for some reason, but generally speaking, Titan at least kills you. Karak Clan Ironworks was banned because of its speed, because of its combos, the turn speed. Also because, much like Sensei's Divining Top, this card could make for an absurdly long turns and absurdly long rounds, especially if it was in the hands of a novice pilot. And it was just a menace to the format that really didn't add anything positive unless you just like playing solitaire or solving puzzles rather than playing a game of Magic the Gathering. So for that reason, Karak Clan Ironworks should probably stay banned, as it was one of the more obnoxious cards to play against. Alright, and the final card for this particular video is Lurrus of the Dream Den. Now, Lurrus of the Dream Den was one of the series of companions printed in the Ikoria set, along with deck cards such as Yorion, Gigantha, etc. Each companion has a deck building restriction, and there's 2 parts to this ban. First off, they tried to nerf the companion mechanic in general. It used to be you could just cast the companion from the companion zone. Then it became you had to pay 3 mana at sorcery speed to put it in your hand. That's the rules change you see here on your screen. And then then you could cast the card. So this will require 3 mana to put it in your hand, and then 3 mana to put it into play. Its deck building description or restriction is once you may cast a spell with mana 2 value or less, and each permanent card in your deck must be 2 mana or less, other than Lurrus as your companion. Now, this isn't as big a restriction as you would think, because you still get to play mana value 3 or greater cards that are spells, as long as they're not permanents. The biggest thing that this got abused with in Modern was Mishra's Bauble. Mishra's Bauble is a 0 mana cantrip, much like Ataxian Probe, that allowed you to look at the top card of target player's library, and this allowed you to kind of get this loop going where you'd be drawing 2 cards of a turn, and if your opponent couldn't deal with the Lurrus of the Dream Den, you could often run away the game with value. Not to mention, this really incentivized you to play cheap cards. Cheaper cards, mana-wise, are generally a little bit better in terms of efficiency and getting the game over with. So for that reason, Lurrus kind of got the axe because of Mishra's Bauble sins. Now, it's banned in Pioneer and banned in Legacy. Pioneer is a little debatable whether it should have been banned, as there really is no 0 mana way to abuse this card, and creature decks in that format could certainly use a boost. Now, Legacy, there was a loop, I believe, with it was Lion's Eye Diamond is part of the reason why it was banned, just because you could get this absurd mana advantage that way, along with cards like Auriok Salvager. So for that reason, in Legacy, it makes a little bit more sense for it to be banned, as there are more broken things you can do with it. But still, it was a dangerous card to leave in Modern, and while I personally think they should have banned Mishra's Bauble instead, they chose to ban Lurrus along with one of its other companions in the form of Urion Sky Nomad, but we'll talk about that in later video. Once again, this is the second of probably 4 videos on the Modern ban list, kind of explaining why cards were on the ban list to begin with, and then my opinion of whether they should come off or not. As always, if you like these kind of Modern content, especially introductory and intermediate content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a comment down below. Hope to see you for our next video.